And welcome to this live stream on the important and very relevant topic of where is God in the coronavirus. My name is Conan Kublik. I am the pastor of New City Church in downtown Hamilton, Ontario. And I'm excited to host this evening on behalf of Noetic Shift, a partnership of churches, including mine, that exists to thoughtfully and respectfully engage the culture of the greater Hamilton area with a distinctly Christian perspective and worldview. Noetic has to do with the mind and the intellect. This means that a noetic shift involved a shift or change in mind. We create safe settings where people from a variety of perspectives are free to discuss the important issues, assumptions, and realities of our world, such as origin, meaning, hope, and identity. As we all know, the world is facing a very serious pandemic at the moment. And as relational beings, we've been forced to social distance, even while the coronavirus has significantly impacted our economy and is changing how every one of us live our daily lives. This deserves some thought and discussion around the important questions of where is God in the coronavirus world? How should we respond? And each of the 4 discussions in this series, Where is God in the Coronavirus, tackles these questions from a different angle. Noetic Shift is excited to partner in this series with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, an organization who, by helping the thinker believe and the believer think, is doing globally what we here at Noetic Shift are trying to do locally. RZIM is a global team of speakers whose primary mission is to reach and challenge those who shape the ideas of a culture with the credibility of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In September of 2018, Noetic Shift hosted Ravi Zacharias and Sam Alberry to a sold-out crowd of over 2,000 people at the First Ontario Concert Hall here in downtown Hamilton. Since then, we've hosted a variety of events and are very thankful for our partnership with RZIM Canada. RZIM was founded by Ravi Zacharias, a Christian apologist and the author of more than 30 books on Christianity. He died of cancer on May 19th at his home in Atlanta at the age of 74. We'd like to now show a short tribute video of him. Ravi Zacharias has been influential to many, including myself, including through his books and a number of his talks. Our condolences on behalf of Noetic Shift to his family and to the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. It's now my honor and privilege this evening to introduce to you Michael Ramsden. Michael spoke in Hamilton at a few events last fall with Noetic Shift, including our Friday evening open forum with Ravi Zacharias. He is a gifted and brilliant speaker. Michael Ramsden is the president of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries and one of the founders of the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. He spent most of his childhood in the Middle East and later moved to the UK, where he worked investing funds for the Lord Chancellor's Department. Michael went on to teach jurisprudence at the University of Sheffield while doing research in law and economics. Michael's passion is to engage people of all backgrounds and cultures about questions of faith, which he's been doing for over 25 years. He speaks in business, academic, and political settings across the globe, ranging from Europe and the Middle East to Asia and the Americas. Michael has been invited to lecture in various settings, including the White House in Washington, D.C., and just last week, Michael gave a talk in Ottawa to political, diplomatic, and professional leaders in Canada. Michael has addressed leaders at NATO headquarters in Brussels, members of the European Parliament, as well as bankers and investment managers from around the globe. Michael helps oversee the international team of RZIM speakers based in 16 offices worldwide. Michael and his family have been based in Oxford for many years, but are in the process of moving to Atlanta, Georgia, to be based at RZIM's headquarters. Thank you for joining us, Michael. And before I turn it over to you, I'd like to note for those watching that we invite your questions. Please write them in below. At the bottom, towards the right of your screen, there's an Ask a Question bar. And Michael will take some time to answer some of them after his talk. Let me turn this over to you now, Michael, to address this challenging topic of where is God in the coronavirus?
Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be able to join you. And in many ways, especially given the subject matter that we're dealing with, it'll be even better to try to be there in person. And maybe that's one of the most challenging issues that we're facing with the current pandemic, is the distance we've had to put between us in order to keep everyone safe, when it's the very time, of course, we actually want to be in someone's presence and actually know a loving embrace around us. As I was thinking about what to share with you on this subject of suffering today, I was reminded of how, as I was thinking and just praying through what would be the best way to start, how when I was about 13 years old, I was at a boarding school in England. My parents were at that point were living in Saudi Arabia. And I developed an unknown, undiagnosed condition that put me in hospital for over 6 weeks. I was having 4 injections every 6 hours. So that was making, what you can do the math, that was making a total of 16 a day. I was put into traction because I'd lost movement in my legs. I was kept in isolation actually for the majority of that time because they couldn't figure out quite what was going on. They were worried that I was contagious. And then when eventually they did move me into a hospital ward, it was a high intensive care unit in which people were dying and passing away on a very regular basis. And I can remember actually at one point just simply looking across at the bed next to me, seeing a man sitting very still holding a newspaper, not moving. And it hadn't even occurred to me that he was no longer alive, and not being able to talk to him, I called a nurse over. And I can just remember going through all of that time. And it's not something I talk about very often, or indeed think about very often, probably because of the intense nature of the experience makes it something which is challenging to share and challenging to actually talk about. But it also maybe says something about the situation we find ourselves in right here. There are some times where we struggle because of the confluence of things which are now affecting us, and we're beginning to wonder whether we ever have the capacity to cope. And it's in that particular situation we may ask the question, where is God? I don't remember very much about that time in the sense that I've never really sat down and chronicled it, but I do very clearly remember a man coming into the hospital and giving me a Bible. It was years later before I would actually even think of opening it. And it was a while after then that someone actually explained to me what it meant. And it made a massive and dramatic difference in my life. But the reason why I want to share that story is the question I've been given is, where is God in all of this? And I can remember after I became a Christian, I actually asked that question in a slightly different way. I had become a Christian and I turned to the person who actually explained the Christian faith with me. And I said, if God really loves me and he really cares, can you explain to me where he's been for all of this time? I feel like I've wasted so much of my life, so much of it I've missed out on. If I knew that this was true and I knew what it would mean to become a Christian, I'd have done it so much earlier. Why has all of this time been wasted? And the guy who was speaking to me said, Michael, if you take a moment and think back on your life, you will see various instances where God actually reached out to you and tried to make an impact into your life and enter your life, and you said no. And I very remember at that time, my immediate response was, no, I'm sure what you're saying isn't right. But I went away and I prayed about it. And then the next day I began to remember various very distinct instances, this being one of them, where actually that was true. And so even as we start to think about this question, where is God in the coronavirus? Maybe the answer is he's much closer than you actually think. Maybe he is actually wanting and waiting to be able to gain an entrance into your heart and life to help you deal with one of the most challenging situations that we face in a very long time. I'd like to say a few general things before we jump in, because I think they're relevant. I'm going to try and compress the actual presentation as much as I possibly can. That's because with a live audience, it's so much easier to feel that sense of connection. When you're speaking to the little green light on your laptop, it's much harder to know whether everyone's tracking you in the way that you're hoping, and also it's also much harder to know whether people are still listening. And so hopefully the brevity there can then be replaced by giving more time over to the actual Q&A itself. But just a few further introductory points as we do this. This is the first time in living memory for almost everybody in the Western world that we have collectively faced the issue of our mortality. So although we may have had to deal with it at an individual level at various points in our lives, as a society as a whole, we haven't had to deal with the challenge of what it means that somehow we may have to collectively face something which could actually be fatal to us. And the fact that we haven't raised it, and the fact that we're now raising it in the absence of a talk about the eternal and the hope of eternal life, actually means, I think, that this is a much more challenging issue for us now than it may have even been for previous generations. And those of you who are old enough to remember will probably be able to cast your mind back 30, 40 years and realize that if this had happened then, almost every single leader around the world would have at some point in the last couple of months said words to the effect of, will you pray? And the absence that we're even being called to maybe turn to the one who can actually really intervene and do something dramatic about the situation we're in just goes to show how isolated we are, not just from each other, but maybe also for the one who also brought us into this world and gave us life and existence and promises to give us meaning even in the midst of suffering. And so I think it is partly why we feel the issue so intensely. And maybe even as we ask the question, there's a numbness to us that's going inside as we wonder what's going on. At the same time, I'm also aware that for some, we've been dramatically impacted by what's happened with coronavirus through the loss of loved ones and so on. And whether we have experienced that or not, we're still all wrestling with the issue of fear. And I can't speak to the situation directly in Canada. And I know even as I'm speaking to people in Canada, I've seen the list. There are some of you from the US and different parts of the world. But I know the way I felt that we were asked to isolate in the United Kingdom was very much driven by fear. Now, interestingly, in the Bible, it talks about contagious disease and what we should do in the face of it. And it talks about isolation. In the book of Leviticus in chapter 13, it says if we have a contagious disease, we should remove ourselves from the community we're in and go outside of the camp or the town for someone else to come and see whether we're actually on the path to recovery or whether things are getting worse. And then you remain outside until you've recovered to come back in. But here's the key point. The reason why you will take yourself out of the community and put yourself into quarantine, into isolation, is not driven by fear for yourself. It's driven by love for everyone else. Out of love, you're taking yourself out of the community and putting yourself in isolation, not because you want to, but because you care for the community as such. You're saying, I don't want to pass on something to you that I'm now wrestling with and that could possibly be fatal. And so much of the motivating factor and response to the coronavirus has been driven by fear, even when we're wanting to help others rather than love. And I'm not sure that actually has either a healthy emotional or psychological impact on the one who has to go through isolation or on society as a whole. And maybe we need to recapture a vision of what it would mean to actually have a loving response and a loving heart in the midst of all of this that's currently going on. Otherwise, there is the possibility that our response to this could actually cause more issues than the COVID-19 itself. I was particularly struck actually on this particular point a couple of weeks ago when I read a report by CNN where they were reporting actually, I think, on the director of the World Food Program for the United Nations. And the director of that program, as he addressed the UN, shared that the economic effect of the lockdown, the response to COVID-19, was in danger of putting 130 million additional poor people at risk of starvation in the coming year. And whatever we're doing now to save the hundreds of lives or maybe even millions of lives that we have undoubtedly saved through our action, if it comes at the cost of 130 million other people having to lose their lives, then I'm not sure we've got a big enough picture to actually process this. And so I think there is also the real risk that we may actually end up generating more issues and more problems and more challenges because of the nature of way in which we've responded. What is the loving response in the midst of all of this? One that's not driven by fear, that's actually driven by love for our brothers and sisters. Even if it comes at great cost to us, what should that actually look like? It's a question that for me is very much in the background. The third thing I'd just like to say very briefly is there is a very big difference between saying, why did these things happen in general? That's the question I'll be trying to also process with you this evening. And why is it happening to me in particular? And that's a harder question to answer because when it's particularized, there are all kinds of reasons why I may be giving any kind of suffering. So when we ask why me, why not someone else, or why this time, or why that location, that is a slightly different question, and it actually requires a much more personal answer. And although I won't be able to give that for all of you, I hope there'll be something in what is ultimately said that will actually meet to you personally and also speak straight into your heart. Now, having given all of those just sort of general observations, let's just start by trying to make two differentiations which are very important when dealing with this subject matter. And you pick up almost any book on suffering, and it's going to actually address this issue right at the very beginning. Because we make a distinction theologically and philosophically between the problem of suffering, natural disasters when things go wrong in this world, earthquakes and so on, and evil when someone does something that has dramatic effects. Now, it's entirely possible during the course of this pandemic we will see both of those, but they are slightly different. When we talk about the problem of suffering, we're talking about what happens when something goes wrong in nature. When we're talking about evil, when we see someone do something which is wrong or act out of selfishness or hatred or whatever that may be, then we're saying something's gone wrong in us. But in both cases, we're actually saying there's something significantly wrong. And that then begs the question, because if we think we can solve this particular question by getting God out of the equation, we then have to raise the second question, which is how do we actually know when something is wrong? What is the standard we're implying to actually say that things shouldn't be this way? Because that's the heart cry that lies behind all of this. It really shouldn't look like this. It shouldn't be this way. Shouldn't it actually be different? And as soon as you've taken God and shut him out of the picture, the answer is, well, no, it doesn't look different. This is exactly the way it should look. This is simply the way it is. But when you put God back in, it does intensify the problem, but it also allows you at the same time to raise this question of, is this the way that it's actually meant to be? So let me try and just put a framework as briefly as I can as why it may be the case that even though we worship a God who loves and cares for us and brought us into this world, we actually find ourselves in this and then come back to that question of where he is in the midst of all of it. There's one last thing, as I've been doing some research on this, assuming the National Geographic has got its numbers right, the number of viruses in this world are measured in something called nononillions. And in case what you're asking what that is, then it's 10 to the power of 31. That means that there are enough individual viruses to give one to every single star in the known universe 100 times over. And a tiny fraction of those actually pose a particular threat to us. So the question then comes, why is it that we find ourselves in this situation at all? And the biblical narrative on this is actually very beautiful, very insightful, and also very hopeful. And I think actually gives us the only meaningful explanation and indeed the only sustenance that we could possibly find to actually take us through it. Because the message of the Bible is that a loving God created a loving world, and he wanted to make it possible for it to experience and to express love. And the idea of a loveless life or a lifeless love is a terrifying one to us. And I'm sure when Vince and Joe are speaking to you next week, they'll be coming to this about what it means when we suddenly find ourselves in a position and we feel we're unable to experience and actually express love. It raises a very difficult challenge for all of us. Now, the interesting thing is, as soon as you create a world, as soon as a loving God creates a loving world and endows it with the capacity for love, you also are going to find a world suddenly in which rebellion and saying no is actually possible. Now, we are increasingly understanding the fact that the things that we do wrong, when we act in the wrong way, it doesn't just simply have an impact on us, it has the impact on the environment as well. As has been said in the introduction, I'm in the process of moving from the United Kingdom to the United States. And let's suppose after I move here, I decide to thank the country that's now welcoming me by burning down all of their forests. And just in case any Americans are watching this, I'm not planning to do it. And if the government's watching, then please don't let this affect my green card application. And this is just an illustration. This is not something I'm actually promising to do. But if I were to do that, it would have dramatic consequences perhaps for me personally, but not just for me personally and for other persons, but for the environment in which we're in. Because it has then dramatic issues about the amount of carbon dioxide that will be released and the fact that we need the forest to keep recirculating the air and provide air which we all need to breathe. In other words, my action doesn't just simply affect me, it can have a lasting effect on the environment in which we're in. And that's exactly the message that Scripture actually gives us, that a loving God creates a loving world. And when we decided to turn away from him and reject him and the way he would have us live, it had dramatic impacts within us in terms of our own hearts and also in the world in which we're in. Both have gone wrong. Both have been affected. Neither are actually operating in the way that they should. This doesn't explain all of suffering. It does explain, however, a part of it. And what that also means is if all of this has been corrupted in this particular type of way, it means whether we're talking about my genes or whether we're talking about the way the world is operating, it's not actually in the place that it should be. Now, There's a beautiful illustration on this, which I know I've used potentially before, and if you've heard it, then please do excuse me. But it's one of the most effective ways I found to actually think about it. If a loving God created a loving world and gave it the capacity for love and a loving experience and expression, but we have rejected him and broken the very laws he gave us to actually make this, our lives and this world operate in the way it is, we're going to see it's broken. Now, there is a sense in which you cannot break God's moral laws. Trying to break God's moral laws, someone once said, is like trying to break the law of gravity. You can climb to the top of a very tall building, put a red cloak around your neck, a big S on your chest, and a pair of red underpants outside the trousers that you're wearing, and throw yourself from the roof in an attempt to break the law of gravity. But what will you break? You will break yourself while proving the law in the process. In that sense, it's impossible to break God's moral law and turn away from him. We simply end up breaking ourselves while proving what he actually told us in the first place. And that is the biblical picture that's given to us in the book of Genesis, that a loving God actually gave us all of these things, but instead of welcoming him and everything that he gave us for the way we're meant to live, we broke those laws and we now live broken lives and inhabit a broken world. And the evidence we see is all around us. But we're told something very powerful too, that this also broke God's heart. It's entirely possible to reason, if this is the case, to come back with a response that goes something like this. Well, if all of that is true and God is God and he knew that things would go wrong in this way, would it not have been a more responsible thing not to have created in the first place? Wouldn't the loving thing not to give us existence, not to create, in order to spare all of this suffering? Because if he created us and he brought us here and he gave us this capacity and it went wrong, surely he's morally culpable in that type of sense. Well, let me see if this illustration has any help at all. It isn't perfect, but I know it's something that's also made me just sit back at times and think, and sometimes think quite deeply. Supposing I knew that there was going to come a time when my 3 children, who currently love both myself and my wife, and we have a wonderful relationship, but if I knew there was going to come a time, for sure, when they would reject me for without reason, that we would have a broken relationship, there'll be unending pain for the rest of my life, and we would never be reconciled. If I knew that was actually going to be the case, what would I do? And the answer is very simple. I'd have different kids. And if you're not sure how you could have different kids, just speak to the church that's hosting this, and they can explain it to you. You just wait a month, different children will be there. In other words, I would choose to give existence to someone different. Now, here's the question. Does it make me more loving or less loving that I would choose to act that way? Is it more loving of God to create beings who we know who may ultimately reject him? Or is it more loving for him never even to give them the privilege of existence in the first place? What is the most loving action? And when we begin to frame that question back into the problem, we begin to see exactly how deep this runs. A loving God created us, knowing what was going to happen, but he also knew what it would cost him in order to try to put it right. It's not that he came up with some strange plan B. In the book of Revelation, we're told that before the foundations of the world were laid, before he even thought about the principles that would be needed in order to sustain existence, let alone a meaningful one, it says, before the foundations of the world were laid, the Lamb was slain, referring to Christ's death on the cross. This isn't saying that before creation there was some kind of mock crucifixion just to see what its effect would be. It's saying that even before God brought things into existence, he knew what was going to happen, and he also knew what it would cost him to put it right. And it was going to cost him everything. He was going to have to give everything. Around my finger, I have this little ring. I don't know if you can actually see it. It's gold, or at least the man who sold it to me told me it was gold. As someone said, it's a small band of yellow that cuts off your circulation. Now, this has value. And the question is, why? And the answer isn't just simply because it's scarce. Even plastic is scarce. There isn't an infinite amount of it. Something has value in economic terms only because we're quite prepared to pay for it. That's how we figure out how valuable something is to us, the price that we're willing to pay. The question is, how valuable are we to God? How deeply does he love us? What price was he prepared to pay in order to give us existence and bring us into the world? And the answer is the greatest possible price he could have paid. That's how much we are worth to him. If gold exists, do you think, if God exists, do you think gold means anything to him? He was willing to give everything himself, the person of Jesus Christ, God incarnate, to pay the price to get us out of the situation that we actually find ourselves in. So it's not just simply a case that we've broken his law and we lead broken lives and live in a broken world. We also read this as broken God's heart, which is why Jesus said the night before he was betrayed, he took a loaf of bread and said, "This is my body broken for you." He did it in order to begin to reverse some of the effects of everything that we now see of living in a broken and fallen world. Not just simply in the world, in creation, but also in our hearts, that which he has created for us to be in relationship with him. And that is actually the invitation that's going to be extended through this evening. And if you were here for the first part and saw our dear friend, Ravi Zacharias speaking, that was the same invitation that he was making. When he said on that video, he understands our hearts, he understands the malady, but he's also prepared a solution that's able to get us out of it and through the cross to bypass the grave and to be with him. The promise which is made in the Christian faith is not that Christians will never suffer, nor that they'll have to go through pandemics. The promise which is made in the Christian faith is that we can find a peace with him that is able to impart a strength of endurance to run this race well. And when you're looking for strength of endurance to run a race, you're not being asked to take out of it, you're being asked to be empowered within it. And that's exactly what Jesus Christ promised when he went from this world, that he would send his Spirit, that we might have that kind of empowered life, that even when we are feeling completely overwhelmed, there is one to whom we can cling who is able to take us through from one side to the other in safety. And that's the message that the death and his resurrection bring. As a matter of fact, the message of the cross and Christ's resurrection speaks directly into this particular issue. There's a very well-known speech which is given in Acts chapter 17 by the early church. And at one point, they make this statement and they say that God has given assurance that he's going to judge all of us by raising someone from the dead, and he has entrusted that person with the right. Now, what on earth does that have to do with this particular question? It means whether we're looking at moral evil or physical suffering. With moral evil, we say, will people get away with it? Will there ever be justice? And when justice fails in a society, hope collapses with it. And we're seeing a little bit of what that could mean right now. And the second thing we're asking is, when we lose someone in the physical, when we're going through suffering, does that mean we'll never see them again? And actually, the scripture is actually very clear. Through the death of the cross, through the cross and the resurrection, both of these questions have been answered. No, justice will be upheld, and the Lord of all this earth will perform justice. But also through the justice of the cross, he's willing to extend mercy and to give us a resurrection body and a new life with him that can never perish, spoil, or fade, and can never be taken away from us. In the book of Romans in chapter 8, it asks the question, once you've actually come to know this love, can anything separate you from it? In other words, is it possible in the midst of suffering, when we're crying, God, where are you in the midst of it? Is it possible to be ultimately separated from him, even if we find that there are moments when we are? And the answer is no. Now, very interestingly, the question it asks is, who will separate us from the love of God? But the answer it gives is, what may separate us from the love of God? It never actually asks the question, who. And the very first two questions, when it says, who will be able to separate us from God's love? It then says, shall trial or tribulation. Now, those two words, literally in the Greek, the first one means to be constrained. The second one means to be hemmed in, which is why we sometimes translate it distress. You hem in an animal, you corner it, it will be distressed. And if there are two words which describe the existence we're currently in, it's exactly those. We're constrained and we're hemmed in. And in Romans chapter 8, it's saying, no, the love of God you can know through Christ because of the cross and the resurrection is so strong that even when we're constrained and even when we're hemmed in and isolated, ultimately he is able to meet us in that moment and be with us and to carry us through. And the very last word given in that list, will the sword separate us? Even if death were to come, is that enough? And the answer is no, it's not enough, because through Christ, we can actually know a victory in this. Now, this isn't some kind of optimistic triumphalism that's been talked about here, because in the very next phrase, it says, we are constantly facing death all day long. We are like sheep that are being led to the slaughter. The guy who's writing this isn't saying, hey, because of this, everything's now fine and I never have any difficulty. No, he says the life I'm living is literally one in which I have to look death in the eye every day. It's almost like we're just little lambs being led away to be killed. But even in that situation, he's saying, I found something here which is deep enough and strong enough to actually carry me through and give me hope. And that's exactly how the cross speaks into this. And that is where God is in the midst of all of this. The God who was crucified and died and indeed raised again to life is able and willing and wanting to enter into our hearts, to be with us, in us, and through this, to give us the endurance, together with the promise of a life which is yet to come and an eternity that we can actually spend with him. And that's the hope that we have. As I was wondering about how to conclude this time together, and please forgive me if I've spoken slightly too quickly, I hope it's come across with clarity. I was reminded of Ravi Zacharias, my former boss. We were friends for 25 years. I think my wife and I possibly had the very last conversation with him that he was able to sustain before he passed. After we met with him, he did speak and say words and nod and interact still. But in terms of a sustained conversation, I think it was the last one. And what was amazing to see was his continued hope, his persistent joy in knowing where he was going to go. And his final words and his final breath, he was saying, we need to share this good news. People need to hear this story about Jesus, this gospel, this message of salvation and light and hope in a world which is filled with so much darkness and death. And the reason why, even as he's going through the pain of bone cancer, which is what ultimately took him, and if any of you have known people who've gone through that condition, you will know how painful that can be and just how overwhelming that pain can be. Trying to get the pain relief right is nigh on impossible because either you're passed out or it feels insufficient to deal with it. Even while he's at that moment, he's still looking forward to what is yet to come. And he knew a love in his life that couldn't be taken away and a separation that ultimately couldn't happen, even though he's now struggling to speak and concentrate because of the amount of pain in his body. He very often, when he talked about suffering, quoted a hymn, and I'd like to finish it with those words with you too. He would tell the story so often of Annie Johnston Flint, who was orphaned at a young age, raised by her grandparents, who then passed before she went to university. While at university, she developed arthritis in its most crippling form. She was then in bed. She was incontinent. She had to wear nappies for the rest of her life. She developed bed sores because of the challenges that she faced. And she wrote many beautiful hymns, and this is one of them. He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To addeth affliction, he addeth his mercy. To multiply trials has multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed and the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limits, his grace has no measure, his power has no boundary known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. If you are watching this and you are a Christian and you're feeling despair right now, know that God can see it. You're able to turn to him and he's able to meet you in it and help carry you through it. And also to help connect you, even if it's going to be virtually in the short term, with the community who are willing to stand with you. But if you don't yet know him, I would urge you, put your life in the hands of the only one who is unable to lose it, the only one who is able to sustain you, to carry you, to lift you when you fall, to forgive you when you fail, to bring light when you're facing despair, and to bring life even when you're looking at the face of death. He is the one who is able to be with you and meet with you. Where is he? He is here with us. He is wanting to be present with you. And that's the hope that we can have when we're living in a world that's facing a pandemic, the results of which we've yet to fully see. Thank you so much for giving me a hearing. I'll now hand back to our host, who will take it forward from here.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was very helpful to hear from you and your thoughts. We're now going to take some time for questions and answers. Again, if you've not done so, please type your questions below. If you go to and click on where it says ask a question at the very bottom, click on that. There you have an opportunity there to put in your question. To moderate our Q&A tonight, we have Alicia Wood. Alicia Wood is an itinerant speaker with RZIM who addresses the major issues surrounding faith to diverse audiences, from major universities to men's and women's prisons. He's passionate about engaging with a person who finds Christianity ugly or unbelievable. When she's not speaking or writing, she's playing violin in her orchestra or spending time in her vegetable garden. She's played hockey for over 20 years and is a Boston Bruins fan. And as someone else who cheers for a team who's not from this local area, I share your pain and sometimes the persecution that goes with it. But please, let me turn it over to you now, Alicia.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the questions. I've been looking through the questions. You guys are clearly thinkers and you've written a lot of questions there. So we're going to do our best to get through some of these questions. I know that there's some that have been upvoted kind of high up and some that have not. So I'm going to jump around a little bit in the Q&A because some people put their question in later on in the talk and it didn't get the chance to be upvoted. So we're going to jump around here to see how Michael can help us understand this topic a little bit better. So Michael, we have a question. You alluded to this a little bit, even in the beginning, about how this virus, this pandemic is affecting even the poor and people who don't have as much, and it's going to leave people with higher rates of starvation and those kind of things. So we have a question here from Manila, Philippines, and it says, how do you explain God as a loving God who created a loving world, to the poor and marginalized, those who are losing jobs, difficulty getting access to food during this time of pandemic. So people just feel like God's abandoned me. You know, the wealthy can make it okay, but God's abandoned me. How do we even begin that conversation about God?
You know, that's such a good question. The full force of this question hit me a few weeks ago. I was being interviewed by a journalist who works for one of the world's most famous financial journals. And he was asking me about the pandemic, and we were talking about exactly this. I was saying, have we ever thought about how this is going to impact everyone else? So I said to him, you and I are living in a home. He was happy because he was with his family more. I was happy because I was seeing my family more. I said, we have space, we have room around us. So this feels like a good experience for us right now. But that isn't true for the vast majority of people in the world. And it's like we're fighting one battle. We feel like we're fighting a battle on one front, but actually we're fighting a battle on multiple fronts, and we have to take a big picture. And then I talked with him about some of these projections and what it could mean for everyone else. And shortly, just before Ravi's memorial service, I needed to pick up a new jacket because the one I brought with me, I hadn't noticed, had a hole in it from a moth. And the two gentlemen who were serving me did such an excellent job. And we got talking about COVID-19 and the lockdown. And I just simply said to both of them, my fear is that the response to this pandemic has been the response of the rich. And they both froze, turned at each other, turned to me, and with one voice said, yes. And I said, you know what, if you have to work to put food on your table, this is a very bad response. Mm-hmm. And so this is where I think we actually have to re-examine some things. If you're in a poor part of the world and obesity isn't an issue, you're going to be naturally less at risk from dying from pandemic anyway. If the average age in the country you're in is measured in its 20s, rather than its 50s or 60s, you're in a whole other different category. And so we have to actually think the actions that we're taking here, how are they impacting everyone else? And so the reason why what's happening right now and how this may affect the poor isn't so much the problem of suffering, it's actually the moral issue we were talking about. And what has really surprised me in all of this, and I'll be honest, when I read this story in CNN, and then I started to look at other secular parts of the media, which would normally pride themselves on being so world conscious and concerned, for the poor and the marginalized and the people who are often forgotten, I can remember thinking, how come you've dropped this story? How come you reported on it for 2 days and then you just dropped it? Is it too difficult for you to ask the question, what we're currently doing is saving millions of lives. It may be measured in hundreds of millions elsewhere. Are there other ways in which we should be thinking of nuancing our response here? How do we protect the vulnerable? How do we protect the elderly? How do we protect those who are naturally predisposed to get the brunt of this, while at the same time realizing that there's risk in all of life, and you can't eliminate all of risk. So the response has to be differentiated. I'll give one last example. I was talking with McClatchy today, who, Alicia, you'll know, he's our director, African director. And he told me the story, but I had forgotten it. I was reminded of it this morning. We were talking about something else, and I've been reading the Financial Times, and in it, there's a graph about the excess number of deaths in every single country, going country by country by country. And in South Africa, they have been less excess deaths overall since the pandemic hit than more. It's the only country in the world to have a drop. And I mentioned this to him, and he said, well, Michael, that's what I said to you 5-6 weeks ago. When they went into lockdown, they closed all the liquor stores because all the liquor stores had been shut down. People dying through violent acts, car accidents, and that kind of stuff. All of that dramatically dropped massively to such an extent that the overall loss of life on average since the pandemic started is less, not more. Of course, he then said, he said, that's an amazing statistic. He says, but here's what's happened. The government, because of the pressure it's come under, is now reopening all the liquor stores. So now it will be going into those excess death numbers. So it just again goes to highlight that the way we respond to this can have a very dramatic effect to our society as a whole. And maybe we just need to have a more holistic response. Otherwise, the poor and the marginalized will be hit hardest with that. And that isn't the right response for us to be making right now. And I hope those who are watching this and those who are in the church will feel that the church historically has been the one willing to step out and incur additional risk to save those around it, which is why during the pandemics in the 1st and 3rd centuries in the early church history, certainly in the second one, you were 8 times more likely to survive, historians think, than if you knew a Christian than if you didn't. Not you're 8 times more likely to survive if you are a Christian, 8 times more likely to survive if you knew one. In other words, everybody else was running away, but Christians were willing to go out onto the streets and help the poor who couldn't run away and didn't have the resources to leave, they minister to them often at the cost of their own lives, when they would then die from the disease that they were trying to rescue other people from. But the people they were ministering to, their survival rate went through the roof, and that made a massive difference. And it partly explained why so many of people in that world after they went through that pandemic in the 3rd century turned to Christ. So Christians at this point, more than any other, shouldn't be driven by fear at this point, but by love. That doesn't mean we're irresponsible. It doesn't mean we do stupid things. But it does mean that there's a strength we should be able to call on at such a time like this to help those who are least able to defend and stand up for themselves.
Thank you, Michael. That's really helpful. Along those same lines, as we are trying to, as Christians, or even just whoever we are as people, we're trying to love people, but also not be fearful of getting sick ourselves through the social distancing. And so how do we balance this? This can be really hard, where you want to love other people, but you don't want to get other people sick. But there's also this attitude of fear, and people don't want to be fearful. How do we deal with some of that?
Yeah, and this is where we have to be careful. One of the challenging things with this pandemic, as Francis Collins has pointed out, the really terrifying thing, and he made this comment very early, is normally when you're sick, you know it. And so you can isolate yourself to protect other people. And the challenge with this particular thing, as we know, is that you can be sick and not know it. And that is an exceptionally challenging situation, which means if you do want to go and visit house to house, for example, and be physically present with someone, which is normally what the church would be expected to do, to visit those who mourn and those who grieve and those who are unwell, they may unwittingly be transmitting something. And in the desire of trying to make things better, making it worse. And that is a very hard thing to do. But maybe there are other things that we can do. I know before as we left Oxford, as it hit, we put a little piece of paper through everybody who lives on our street, every home, every apartment, with my cell phone number, and we set up a WhatsApp group, and we said, look, if there's any way we can help anyone on the street, please let us know. Well, guess what? A lot of other people on the street wanted to help too. And one of the people who responded back was a retired, I think she's a retired university professor. He's a retired doctor, both in their 80s. And they said, we have a daughter. She lives miles away from us. She can't help. She's been helping her neighbors. We've been hoping and praying that someone would come along to help us. And so my wife and I, together with our children, were taking turns to pick up their prescriptions twice a week, to do their food shopping, to drop it off at their door, taking all the precautions we needed to as a way of serving. So even if we can't do what we most want to do, which is put our arms around somebody, then maybe there are other ways in which we can demonstrate that love and care and concern for them. And maybe that's what we need to be thinking about doing.
That's great. Thank you. As someone who isn't living with their family, the idea of having to self-isolate can be daunting for some people. And so I've seen several questions here. I'll read them both to you that relate to this idea of having to be isolated. One of them says, in this time of the virus, I find myself feeling more and more numb towards God, and it's harder to connect with him. How do I fight through that? And so you're already, having to be isolated, having to deal with the virus, all these things, and you're feeling numb towards God. But also the isolation of COVID is very challenging. Even in the Garden of Eden, God said it's not good for man to be alone, and Eve was created. So I isolate out of love and protection for myself and others. How do we deal with the ongoing isolation when you live alone? Have to be friends, don't have family around. So maybe first, how do we deal with the isolation alone? But then also, how do we deal with God and feeling numb towards him because it's hard to connect with him during this time?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, this is going to have to be filtered through whatever legal structures are in Canada at the moment. I know in the UK recently, the government's been so aware of the existential toll, people's mental health, emotional distress, rates of suicide going so high that they've created this idea of social bubbles. Okay, look, connect with a few other people and just keep the connection within that group, so that there's still some sense of protection, and the chance of contagion is greatly minimized. And if that is possible and permissible, I would say that to find those settings in which you can actually do that, and whether that's with some former work colleagues or with neighbors or however, depending on what's actually allowed, it is very helpful. Doing what we're doing now through Zoom can be very, very helpful one-on-one as well. I've been surprised the strength of connection I've sometimes felt. I still long for that physical connection. It means so much more when it comes that way. But if that's not possible doing this, and I think even just practical things of thinking, I'm just going to make a discipline of calling other people, or dropping an email to a colleague who I normally get on with and say, how are you doing? I'd love to Zoom over a cup of coffee or something. Just anything just to keep the social interaction going. I would just so strongly recommend. And if you are permitted to form bubbles, try to find a way, whether it's with neighbors or with someone else, reach out. And if that doesn't work, I'd even suggest just get online with the church and just see if there's any possibility in which they might be able to be part of that for you. Which brings me into the second point you're asking about God. I can remember just as COVID-19 was kicking off and the lockdown came in, having to record, I did a series of short 5-minute talks that we pushed out called Take 5. And in one of those, I remember talking about something called Rosh Hashanah, which is a Jewish festival that happens 10 days before the day of Yom Kippur. And it's a fascinating festival where they remember who is actually king in this world and who's actually in charge of it. Now, the reason why that festival spoke so strongly to me is I was reading a book by the former chief rabbi of the UK and the Commonwealth, in which he said, when the Jews were forced out of their land and they were separated from each other and separated from their homeland, how did they maintain their identity and their connection to God, even when they weren't able to physically gather in the place they wanted to be? And the answer is that they had learned to worship and recognize God as their king, regardless of the physical position they found themselves in, and regardless if they could be in the physical place they wanted to be. And that's exactly where we are. We are in a position where we're not able to gather in the way that we would like, physically in our building, and we're also being separated from those around us. But that doesn't mean that God is no longer king. We still need to be able to find that relationship with him. And interestingly, coronavirus, and I know John Lennox's book is going to be recommended through this, and I'd recommend it also. Do get hold of it if you can. The reason the coronavirus is called coronavirus is that the protein parts coming out of it look like a crown. So that's literally what it means. It looks like a crown. The question is, who's wearing the crown? Is Christ able to be king in and through this or not? And that's when I think online church and making the habit of being together and actually being part of a small group and again, meeting, talking, praying like this is so important at such a time like this. We're not designed to be complete hermits. We need to find that connection. Even if it's not what we want, then let's just take what we get and then try and remember who is actually king in and through all of this.
Well, thank you. I think I would definitely agree. As someone who has been in isolation for a while now, I think one of the things that I've had to think through is, okay, Alicia, what can you do in this time that you don't get to do in other times? Spending so much time traveling means that there's a lot of things I don't get to do. And so one of the things that I've been doing is learning new recipes. Like maybe I can learn some new recipes, or maybe I can practice my instruments more. How can I utilize house repairs? Anytime you go into the house repair store, the hardware store, I feel like it's mobbed with people. People are trying to get all these things done. And so I've tried to find little ways for me to just be active, because I think one of the worst things is for me to be kind of just in the settled, like alone with my thoughts kind of thing. And I think, being active, how can you make the most of this time so it's productive? But also, what neighbors can I visit from afar or say hello to from afar, get to know the neighbors that are around, and different things, like little piece of communication and a little bit of real life, even in isolation, has helped me to kind of make it through this time as well. But in addition to all of this COVID, Michael, it's like we went from one thing to the other. We had COVID, and then it seemed like the world kind of was upended with a lot of tension. A lot of people really struggling with each other. There's a lot of pent-up emotion. There is racial tension as well. There's a lot of things going on. And so somebody actually said, how do we as Christians continue to act out our faith in a winsome manner while there's so much tension in our communities? Emotions are so high. It seems like, how in the world do we even begin to talk about God? Or is this even the right time to talk about God? Or is there a place for God in this tension? So if you have any thoughts you'd like to share with us on that.
Yeah, sure. And as you were talking, I was also just looking at the chat, and someone just said, look, I'm from a Jewish background. I haven't heard of that festival. If you want to learn more, just Google Jonathan Sacks, S-A-C-K-S. He is the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom. He has a brilliant mind, truly excellent. He has a little series on festivals, Jewish festivals. Have a look at that. You'll find it very interesting. It happens 10 days before Yom Kippur. Let me just come back to this issue that you mentioned too. It's so... it's around us, and the reason is that we are designed, because we've been created in God's image, to respond to failure of justice in the same way He does. So there is a very interesting part of the New Testament where God says, "You do not hate what I hate." In other words, He's talking to His people. He's saying, "Look, you don't seem to care about what is wrong," and that's a very strong thing. So there are some things which call forth an action from us. And in Ephesians 4, we actually see this spoken to very, very clearly. 20 years ago, I think I would be asked questions a lot about God's wrath, and it would go something like this. How can you Christians who say your God is so loving and so kind and so forgiving, how can he be so wrathful? I can't possibly worship a God like that. It's completely contradictory. Now it almost feels like people are saying your God is too weak. He doesn't feel strongly enough about justice issues. How can I? Now, this is what's very, very, very interesting. In Ephesians 4, it says, when God sees that which is wrong, the response he has, the Greek word there, this active anger about injustice is there. That's how he feels about it. So if you want to know how God feels about injustice and sin, it's wrapped up in that word. Now, that may explain, if we're created in his image, why we feel that. But we're also told something very interesting in that passage too, that our wrath, human wrath, doesn't bring about righteousness. In other words, even we may initially feel that sting and that this is wrong, that outrage isn't actually going to be sufficient to positively take us through the moment. And you see the same message being given in the Old Testament too, where in the book of Hosea, twice it says, the second time actually, more powerfully than the second, Amos, you have turned justice into bitterness, so all your righteousness tastes like poison fruit. What that verse is saying there is, if the pursuit of justice itself becomes bitter, even if you get what is right, it may taste like poison to everyone else. In other words, you may have destroyed the very thing you sought to rescue. So I think you're absolutely right. We need a word now that not just simply casts vision and brings hope and motivates to action and actually changes what needs to happen. All of those things have to happen. It also has to deal with the bitterness that is being felt in a way that helps overcome it. In other words, if we pursue the right thing in the wrong way, that's what we'll be left with. So if our pursuit for justice in this world is motivated by bitterness, when we get justice, we're left with the bitterness. And even Hollywood classically has understood that. You watch any classic Hollywood revenge film, many of them, will be, westerns or gangster movies or someone, and someone will set on a path of revenge to kill all the people who killed those their loved ones. It gets to the end of the movie and they all finish the same way. Someone will turn to the hero, the main character, the protagonist of the story, and they'll say, was it enough? Have you got what you wanted? And they'll always say, it's not enough. Or I thought it would bring me peace, but it hasn't. In other words, I got the vengeance I thought I wanted that would bring me peace, and it hasn't. If the quest for justice is driven by bitterness, when you get justice, you're left with the bitterness and the emptiness. But if the quest for justice is driven by love and compassion, when you get justice, you're left with love and compassion. And that works out very differently into our society. So I think we can say at one level, we understand that we can call out the injustice, which is undoubtedly there. We can understand that initial anger, the hot anger that then comes in response to it. But then the next question is, what is going to be the driving thing that can actually push through change and answer and deal with some of these things and leave something behind that's actually worth living for? So we're going to have to find a way through this difficulty. Otherwise, we'll be in danger of just simply tearing ourselves apart in the process, even though what we're pursuing is right.
Excellent. Thank you. When we talk about all of these things, COVID, and even just tensions that are happening, so often Christians will turn to prayer. They'll turn to God and just look for God to somehow hear the prayer and respond because of the prayer. So you have a couple questions here on prayer. One says, is there one way you should pray? Does one way work better than another? But another one says, if God allowed the pandemic, then what is the role of Christians and missionaries as well in the church? How can we tell people to come to church when many of our friends say they don't have a need for church and they don't pray, saying that things will happen as it is, like there's no point to pray. So people, in a sense, get discouraged because it's like God doesn't seem to answer prayers. So is there a way that we should pray, and it makes it harder for people to try and tell people, hey, Jesus actually is someone you're interested in, because it doesn't seem like he's answering prayers? Any thoughts on that?
I think the one of the things we all have to wrestle with in prayer is we don't always get what we want. And that's something which is very important to remember. So that doesn't mean, therefore, that God doesn't care or he isn't listening, but maybe it's not going to work out in the way that we actually think it could work out. So what I would encourage anyone who's wrestling with prayer is, if you haven't read it, it's a challenging book to read, but read the book of Job. Because what is fascinating with that is when he's having his human conversation, it's utterly disappointing. If you're going to read the book of Job, you have to remember Job is suffering. Some friends come to comfort him. Almost everything his friends say are wrong. And we know that because at the end of the book, God says everything they said was wrong. So when you're reading the replies of Job's friends to him, just remember that's going to be God's comment at the end. But here's the really interesting thing. In the book of Job, it's a fascinating verse. It comes right up in the very opening chapters. Job loses everything. He comes before God. He pours out his complaint before God. And then it says, and in all of this, Job did not sin by accusing God of wrongdoing. Now that's remarkable. Job came before God and said, God, I think you're wrong. And what you've done is wrong. And it makes no sense. And I would love to see you justify yourself to me, because I can't see any possible way you could do that. And that tells me something. In your prayer life, if you're coming before God and you're trying to make things better than they really are, you're not going to get very far. That's lying. I mean, we can call it deception or masking or whatever. But if you come before God and say, look, everything's fine, but, and you pray like that, but actually inside that's not what you feel, then you're not being honest either with him or yourself. If you come before God and say, this is exactly how I feel, and this is exactly what's going through my heart and mind right now, then at least you're telling the truth. Now, he may not have approved where you are, and he doesn't want you to stay where you are. He wants you to get through it, but it has to start with an acknowledgement of where you actually are. And so when you begin to see prayer, not so much as giving a request list like you would give to a pizza company and asking them to deliver your pizza, but you see it as a conversation, a way to have communion with the one who knows more about what's going in and through this than we ourselves may know, then all of a sudden that's a very different dynamic, and it can have a very different result. So God, I think, does answer our prayers and speak to us through prayer. It may not just simply come in the way that we're always necessarily expecting. And there can be moments in my life now where I can look back and think, God, I wish you had done this, and why didn't you shorten that? And why did I have to go through all of that? With the benefit of hindsight, I can maybe begin to formulate an answer to it. But when I'm in the midst of it, what I've learned now is the main thing I'm asking for is, God, please give me the strength and give me endurance. And even if it comes with tears and with pain and everything else, the one person I know I can trust in all of this is you.
Yeah.
And that makes a big difference.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's always been a bit intriguing with me is as you read Job, one of my favorite books, and even the Psalms, where people are wrestling with God not answering, where are you? You've abandoned me, all of these things. But at the end of it all, then they're like, but I will trust in your goodness. I will trust in you. And there's a sense where we do have to be uncomfortable in not getting what we've asked for with the prayer, or uncomfortable in the pain and what's the discomfort of what's going on, by not because things are better. We don't get comfortable because things are better. We're comfortable because although everything over here is changing in our life, God hasn't changed. And that is like the same foundation that we can trust in, and just know that at least he is being consistent, even though it feels like our world is spinning. And in some way, it gives me a bit of peace. It doesn't mean that the pain goes away or that anything feels better, but it definitely gives me a bit of peace to know that God does see. He hasn't missed it. He hasn't been like, oops, I didn't see that coming, or, oh, I don't know how to fix that. Like, he's actually calm. He's okay. Like, nothing's changed with his character, his goodness. And to me, that gives me a sense of peace to trust in him. So thank you for what you had said on that. There's also a question here on just the fact that, we have a desire to maybe be a certain way. And this is for Christians and non-Christians. This particular question was raised from a Christian, but I think it applies to just us as humans, where we desire to live in a certain way, but yet we fail. We don't consistently live in the way that we want to. And that can be very discouraging, can be frustrating. We can get disappointed with ourselves. How do we deal with the fact that we aren't always as good as we want to be? Does God hate us for that? Should we hate ourselves? How do we deal?
That's an amazingly honest question, and thank you so much for it, because it also raises something very important about the gospel of Jesus Christ. Before I became a Christian, I can remember I was weighing, could I become a Christian or not? And I remember talking to someone who was a Christian, and I said, look, I don't think I'm good enough. And I was worried. I said, look, I feel like I'm going to become a hypocrite. I'm going to become a morally worse person after I become a Christian than I am right now. Because right now, my life and my standard match, because my standard was very low. And now I'm meant to be living like this, and my life is down here. And so, suddenly I'm becoming a hypocrite. And they looked at me and they said, Michael, when I made a decision to become a Christian, it wasn't a decision to be perfect. It was first and foremost a decision to be forgiven. And that spoke very strongly to me. It made me realize for the first time that this was actually about the fact that I do fail and I will fail, but God is willing to forgive if I'm willing to come before him and acknowledge what I've actually done rather than pretend I haven't done it and then receive the forgiveness that he secured for me through his death and his resurrection, where he's paid the price for what I have actually done. Now, that's not an excuse, therefore, to keep on sinning. That's a problem that even early Christians had to address. And one early Christian by the name of Paul had to deal precisely with that problem, because some in the church thought, oh, okay, well, that we can argue that. And he's saying no, because if you've deeply offended God and you've been forgiven and you've experienced the depth of that forgiveness, the consequence should be that you fall in love with them. And when you fall in love with someone, you want to be with them and you want to get on with them, not because they're making you, but because you now have this desire in your heart to make that work. And that's what's called the fruit of repentance. It's saying, if you have truly encountered God and you've encountered the depth of his forgiveness and the depth of his love in light of everything that you have done and the depth of your sin, when you receive that forgiveness from him, you will want to be with him and you'll want to be different. Not because he's forcing you to, but because you now want to be with him. And just like if you've fallen in love in a human relationship, you know that you will still mess up and you'll still go wrong. If the other person still loves you, there's still that possibility for reconciliation. The difference is when we're in a loving relationship with God. In a human relationship, it's normally two-way. We're both failing and we both need to learn to forgive each other. But with him, he won't fail us even though we may fail him. And that forgiveness is ongoing. So the encouragement I would give is it doesn't help for us to pretend to be in a place we're not. If we're not a Christian, then it is having that strength to come before him and step into his light. And it's a very scary thing when you step into God's light, because you think, I'm going to be exposed. But in John chapter 3, we're told the reason that we step into the light isn't so that we can be exposed, but so we can be transformed and we can know that forgiveness. It's a hopeful thing. It then goes on to say in John chapter 3 that if we stepped into the light, we will remain in the light so that everyone else can see that what's been done has been done by God. In other words, it's not Michael Ramsden's a great person anymore. It's, wow, what kind of God was able to take him from there to here? And what kind of God is still at work in his own heart and mind that when he does fail, he's willing to come back and say, look, I'm really sorry, that was wrong. Please forgive me. Mm-hmm. And so we need that there. And so if behind the question is also this issue of, look, I'm just feeling discouraged right now in my relationship, the answer isn't to try to pretend and just somehow reset in a fake way. What I would say is, no, you're going to be much better off looking full on the extent of what you've actually done, what it actually cost God to rescue you, and then realize that he still loves you and wants you back with him. He wants his children to be with him because he is a loving father. And that is an amazing thing. And that's why there's so much hope, which is inherent to the Christian faith and why it can be so transformative in all of our lives.
Wow, thank you, Michael. And I want to ask you one final question, and feel free to give us any final closing comments that you'd like at the end of this question. This particular person, this is a specific question, but I'm going to broaden it out. It says, how should I reply when told believing in God as the reason for creation is lazy compared to believing in scientific theories? But I want to broaden it out so that it's not just about creation and scientific theories, because I think a lot of us are looking for a reason to believe in God. Most Christians don't believe in God because they're just looking for an origins explanation, but because they think that he's actually there. What reason do we have for really believing in God, and why would we even want him to be there anyways?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. At times of trouble, we sometimes think it would be nice if God was there, but sometimes it can be a slightly scary thought too. Simply because of what we were talking about earlier, about this whole idea of light coming in and shining in our life to show us what we're actually really like. And I think there are a variety of responses to that. The first one is that, and I can't remember exactly who said this first, but if I was to invent a God, I wouldn't invent the Christian one. I'd invent someone very different. Certainly not one who actually talked about the fact that there will be a day of reckoning and will be held to account. That's not what I would put in there at all. And so the fact is that there is a God who's revealed in the Bible, who is historically revealed, who was physically incarnated, who we can establish went to the cross on our behalf. There's a very strong argument for his resurrection from history. I think when we look at actually some of the science, and again, John Lennox is a scientist, I know that book's going to be made available. There are many scientists who are adults who have become Christians. Richard Dawkins, I think, once made the real comment, yes, but it's like coming to believe in Father Christmas. And Professor Alistair McGrath, who I've also had the privilege of working with, and who I know has also taught you, when you were with us in Oxford. Alistair McGrath says, well, look, I've met a lot of children who used to believe in Father Christmas and grew up to disbelieve in him. But I have never seen an adult who didn't believe in him come to suddenly believe in Father Christmas. But I've seen many adults who were atheists, such as myself and a scientist, who've come to believe in him. The evidence is actually, I would say, very, very strong. So he is there. But we also see that he cares. And again, it's fascinating, the idea that God is righteous, which can sound scary to us because it means that he is good. Now that phrase, again, as we understand it biblically, both in the Tanakh and the first 5 books of the Bible, and in the New Testament, that phrase means more than a moral standard. It also refers to God's mighty acts in history in order to save, which is why in the book of Romans, chapter 3, it says, we have now seen God's righteousness more brilliantly displayed in the person of Jesus Christ and his Son. It's not saying God was almost good in the Old Testament, but he's much morally better now. It's saying, no, we have seen his mighty acts in history in order to save in the past, through the parting of the Red Sea and rescuing people and so on. We have seen that. That was his righteousness at work. But now we have seen a righteousness displayed where he is bringing salvation for all people, for anyone who's willing to turn to him to find forgiveness and peace with God. And so it's not just the fact that there's all the objective side there, there's also then the existential reality of entering into a relationship with him, which is so important because it means that when the argument fails or our mind is exhausted, there is still actually a person, that God is inviting us not to accept an idea or to believe in a creed, but to enter into a relationship with an actual person. And those personal relationships are things which are able to transcend all of the trauma and all of the other difficulty that we may see in the world and sustain us. And that's the other side of this equation, which helps bring that reality home. And it's the one that I hope everyone will be able to take away from this evening.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you all for submitting your questions. Try to get through and clump some together so we can get through more. But I really appreciate you taking the time to write those questions. And I hope that you felt really enriched by these answers. I want to go ahead and turn it back on over to Conan.
Thanks to both of you. That was very helpful, Michael. But thanks as well to Alicia for curating those questions, because I know for me, there was just so much rich stuff there in the way that you answered those questions, Michael. So I really appreciate that. Tonight, we're giving away a free book to those of you who are not Christians. The book, as Michael already mentioned, is Where is God in a Coronavirus World? Christians, hear me out on this. We encourage you to buy it. We encourage you to read it or get the audiobook. And I saw that on Kindle or on Audible, you can probably even get it free if you're not already signed up. But please, this offer is not for you, but we are giving away a free book to those who are still skeptical of Christianity. To receive this book, please go to the Contact Us page at noeticshift.org. That is NOETICSHIFT.org. And fill in the form with book in the comments section. And for those of you who watched tonight and participated tonight, we are so grateful that you could join us. Please join us next week at the same time and place as we continue in this very same series. RZIM's Dr. Vince and Dr. Joe Vitale will be speaking on love at arm's length, what social distancing teaches us about relationships. Please join us, and please do invite others to this very important series on Where is God in the Coronavirus. On behalf of both Noetic Shift and RZIM, I'm Conan Kublik. Thank you and good night.